It was late January in New Hampshire, deep in the heart of winter, and the mountain air was biting cold. We had planned this hike for weeks. The goal was to climb one of the 4,000 footers, a peak in the White Mountains that I had done before but could never get enough of. The snow had fallen heavily the night before, adding fresh layers to the already deep blanket that coated the ground. The trails would be icy, treacherous, and steep, but I was ready for it. I had all the right gear: insulated waterproof boots, gaiters, microspikes, a reliable ice axe, layered clothing, gloves, and a good pack filled with extra food, water, and emergency supplies. My hiking buddy was no novice either. We had been on countless winter hikes together, and we trusted each other's skills and judgment implicitly. We started early in the morning before sunrise. The sky was still a deep navy blue, with a few stars fading away as the horizon lightened. The air smelled crisp and clean, carrying the faint scent of pine and frozen earth. The trailhead was quiet, with only a few sets of fresh footprints in the snow from hikers who had started earlier. Our breaths came out in white clouds as we began the ascent. The ground was covered in a thick layer of snow, with patches of ice hiding beneath. We moved cautiously but steadily, our microspikes crunching softly against the frozen trail. The first miles were gentle, winding through dense stands of spruce and fir. The trees were heavy with snow, their branches bending under the weight. Every now and then, a flock of chickadees or juncos darted through the branches, their bright calls adding a bit of life to the silent woods. The snow was deep, but the trail was well marked with small orange blazes on the trees. The cold air bit at any skin exposed, but our layered clothing kept us warm and dry. I felt steady and strong, my legs working smoothly, my breathing calm and even. As we gained elevation, the forest began to thin. The tall, dense trees gave way to shorter, more stunted growth. The winds were stronger here, whipping through the branches and biting colder against our faces. The trail grew steeper, and the snow and ice thickened. The rocky terrain beneath the snow was more exposed, making the footing tricky. We switched to our ice axes and tightened our microspikes for extra grip. This part of the trail was always the most challenging in winter. The mountain's rocky face stretched ahead of us, covered by a thick sheet of ice. In the summer, this would have been a scramble over boulders, but now the ice smoothed everything into a slippery, deadly surface. The trail crossed this ice sheet diagonally, from right to left. Just before the ice began, there was a small ledge we had to jump down to reach it. I checked the landing carefully. The snow was packed hard, but I saw no obvious hazards. My buddy went first, moving carefully, placing his feet firmly on the ice as he crossed. I followed, lowering myself to the ledge and jumping down. My microspikes hit the ice first, but then something went wrong. My feet slipped out from under me in an instant. I wasn't sure what had caused it. Maybe it was a hidden patch of polished ice under the spikes or a small misstep. But the next thing I knew, I was sliding downhill on my butt. The momentum was fast and uncontrollable. The ice sheet sloped sharply downwards, and I was sliding feet first toward a sheer drop. The drop was about 15 feet, a vertical cliff carved into the mountain. Falling from that height wouldn't have been deadly, but it could have seriously injured me. Broken legs, crushed ankles, maybe worse. As I slid closer to the edge, panic flickered in my chest. The wind whipped past my face, cold and fierce. My hands scrambled for anything to grab. There, two small, stunted trees stood close together at the edge of the drop. Without thinking, I reached out and grabbed each tree with both hands. The bark was rough and cold, biting into my palms, but the grip held. The slide stopped abruptly, and I dangled there for a moment, heart pounding, legs trembling. I looked back up the slope where my buddy was standing, watching with wide eyes. I yelled up to him that I was okay, but I needed a minute to catch my breath. I sat there on the icy ledge, catching my breath, feeling my pulse slow. My legs tingled from the cold and adrenaline. The danger was far from over, but I needed to steady myself before trying to move. I tested my microspikes, tapping them against the ice to get a sense of their grip. The trees I was holding onto looked small but strong, their roots clutching the rocky soil beneath. After a few minutes, I started to carefully shift my weight, finding a way to edge back uphill and away from the drop. Once I was safe, my buddy came down to help me, his face serious but calm. Together, we moved slowly across the ice, stepping cautiously, using our axes for support. The rest of the hike to the summit was tense but uneventful. We reached the top just before noon, the wind howling around us as we took in the wide, snow-covered expanse below. The sky was a pale gray, heavy with clouds, but the view was breathtaking, endless white peaks stretching as far as the eye could see. We stayed for a short while, eating some food and drinking warm water from our thermoses before starting the descent. The trail back down was just as slippery and steep, but the sun was breaking through the clouds, warming the air slightly. We moved carefully, resting whenever we needed, keeping close and alert. The rest of the hike went smoothly. We reached the trailhead in mid-afternoon, tired but exhilarated. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the snow. I thought back to that moment on the ice, the sudden slide, the panic, the relief of grabbing those trees. It was the scariest moment I'd ever had on the mountain. Not because I had done anything stupid, but because sometimes, despite all the experience and preparation, nature can still surprise you. That day taught me a lot about respect. Respect for the mountain, respect for the ice, and respect for the small things, the stunted trees, the rocky ledge, the way your body can react in a split second. It was a reminder that even with all the gear, the training, and the experience, you can never be too careful. The mountain is always in charge. We packed up and left as the last light faded, the cold settling in again. The car heater felt like a blessing after hours in the cold, and the drive home was quiet, both of us lost in our thoughts. I knew I would be back to that mountain, to those winter trails, because there is something about the challenge, the beauty, and yes, even the danger that keeps pulling me back. But after that day, I never took an icy slope for granted again. This past summer, we visited Montana for the first time. It was a trip we had been planning for a while, drawn by the promise of vast wilderness, towering mountains, and endless hiking trails. When we finally landed at the small airport just outside a quiet town, the sun was shining brightly, the sky a deep, clear blue. The heat was strong but comfortable for July, the kind of day that makes you want to get out and explore immediately. So, without wasting any time, we grabbed our backpacks from the baggage claim, stepped outside, and immediately said to each other, "Let's go hiking right now." It felt like the perfect way to start our Montana adventure. We picked a popular trail near the airport, one known for its scenic views and manageable length. A nice 2 or 3 mile hike winding through dense forest and gentle hills. The trailhead was easy to find, and the path was well marked with wooden signs. As we set off, the air was fresh, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. The trees around us were tall and thick, their branches swaying slightly in the warm breeze. Birds chirped sporadically, and we caught glimpses of small animals darting through the underbrush. Everything felt peaceful, calm, and welcoming. We walked at a steady pace, taking in the sights and sounds, snapping a few pictures here and there. The trail was wide enough that we could walk side by side comfortably, and the ground was soft with layers of pine needles. We felt the sun on our faces, but the shade of the tall pines kept the temperature pleasant. About 2 miles in, the sky started to shift. The blue began to dull, replaced by patches of gray clouds drifting in from the west. The air grew cooler, and the birds quieted. It was subtle at first, but the weather was definitely changing. We talked to ourselves, silently agreeing that if the weather turned worse, we would turn back. We didn't want to get caught out in a storm far from the car. The last thing we wanted was to be stranded in the woods without shelter or dry clothes. So we kept an eye on the sky and moved a little faster. After about 20 more minutes, the clouds thickened, and a light drizzle began to fall, fine drops that made the needles on the trees glisten. The ground beneath us was starting to get slick, and the smell of wet pine filled the air. Then, suddenly, I heard it, a loud boom echoing through the forest. At first, I thought it was thunder, but the sky didn't seem dark enough for a real storm. Still, It was a strange sound, more powerful and close than anything I'd heard before while hiking. Then another boom followed quickly by another. They came in quick succession, loud and sharp. It wasn't like the distant, rolling thunder you hear during a summer storm. These were explosive sounds, like something heavy falling or breaking somewhere nearby. We froze for a moment, listening as the noise repeated, booming off the trees and hills. The wind suddenly shifted. At first, it was just a gentle breeze, but then it picked up with alarming speed. Pine needles, dust, and small bits of dirt whipped around our faces. It felt like a sudden gust, maybe close to 40 miles per hour, strong enough to push against us as we tried to stand upright. The air turned cold, and the sky darkened rapidly. We looked around, trying to figure out where the sounds were coming from. Then I saw it. Not thunder at all, but the tops of full-sized pine trees snapping and crashing down around us. The booms were the sounds of trees being torn from the earth, their trunks splitting and falling through the air like giant clubs. The noise was deafening, the forest alive with the violent sounds of destruction. Branches cracked and smashed against other trees, needles showered down in thick curtains, and dirt exploded from the ground where roots ripped free. I shouted to my girlfriend and sister, motioning urgently. We needed to run. There was no time to waste. We started sprinting back down the trail, the wind pushing against us and the sounds of falling trees all around. I glanced behind me and saw huge trees crashing down mere feet away from us, some falling across the path we were trying to follow. The ground shook with each massive impact. At one point, my sister ran just ahead of a tree as it crashed behind her, narrowly missing her by inches. Her face was pale, her breath coming in short gasps, but she kept moving without stopping. My girlfriend and I kept pace, the fear pushing us to run faster than we ever had before on a trail that had moments ago seemed so calm and inviting. The trail was suddenly filled with obstacles, fallen branches, uprooted trees blocking the path, and the ongoing roar of the wind tearing through the forest. The air smelled sharp and earthy, mixed with the scent of fresh pine sap broken open by the destruction. Our clothes were damp from sweat and rain, hair tangled with pine needles and dust. We finally reached the clearing where we had started, just as the storm seemed to lose some of its power. The trees beyond the trail were still creaking and groaning, but no more were falling. We stood there, catching our breath, hearts pounding, faces wet with a mix of rain, sweat, and dirt. The next day, the weather had cleared completely. The sun was shining again, and the sky was bright blue, almost like the day before. But the forest looked different. We went back to hike the full trail this time, determined to see just how much damage the storm had caused. As we walked, it became clear how severe it had been. At least 25 trees had fallen across the trail, blocking large sections completely. Some were massive pines, their roots ripped up and broken, others snapped like toothpicks and scattered in pieces. The ground was uneven, littered with branches and needles, and the air still smelled faintly of wet wood and earth. We carefully climbed over or around each fallen tree, sometimes having to detour off the trail to find a clear path. The peacefulness of the forest was replaced by a quiet stillness, as if the storm had left a scar on the landscape. The animals seemed cautious too. We spotted fewer birds and animals than the day before. As we reached the end of the trail, I felt a deep respect for the power of nature. That storm had come out of nowhere, catching us completely off guard. It showed me how quickly things can change in the wilderness, how unpredictable and dangerous it can be even on a day that starts so calm and bright. Despite the fear and chaos of the storm, I felt grateful we had made it out safely. It was a reminder to always be prepared, to respect the environment, and to never underestimate the forces around us. That trip to Montana was unforgettable, not just for its beauty, but for the raw power we witnessed firsthand in those forested hills. We left the trail with a new appreciation for the wild, knowing that sometimes, even the most peaceful places can turn fierce in an instant. That day, the forest taught me a lesson I won't forget, one about survival, respect, and the unpredictable strength of nature. The air was biting cold, the kind of cold that sinks deep into your bones and makes your breath catch before it leaves your lungs. It was late winter, the sky a flat sheet of gray, threatening snow that never quite came. We were deep in Northumberland, miles from any sign of town or road, surrounded by nothing but the raw wilderness. This part of the country was famous for its bogs, endless patches of marshland and soft mud, some hidden under shallow water that could swallow a foot or more without warning. We'd spent the day pushing through this difficult terrain, and now, after nearly 15 miles on foot, exhaustion had settled like a weight on my shoulders. The last stretch should have been simple. The trail led to a small village where we had left the car, and all we had to do was follow the path back. My partner was eager to reach the end point quickly, tired and ready to rest, but I was stubborn. I suggested we try a different route, a shortcut I thought I remembered from an old map. I said it would cut off some time, avoid some of the worst bogs, and maybe give us a bit of adventure. She warned me against it, but I pressed on. That shortcut hadn't been used in decades. I found out the hard way. At first, the path looked promising, a narrow trail cutting through a thick line of trees. But it was clear no one had been here for years. The ground was uneven, covered with dead leaves that hid twisted roots and slippery patches of moss. The further we went, the worse it got. The trees grew closer, branches tangled in ways that forced us to duck and weave. The bogs, instead of disappearing, seemed to multiply on either side of us, sucking at our boots whenever we stepped too close. Time passed faster than we realized, and the sun was dipping low, a pale orange glow lost behind thick clouds. The forest swallowed the light quickly, and by the time we realized how far we had strayed from the main trail, dusk was giving way to full night. The deep winter darkness in Northumberland was something else entirely. No streetlights, no moon, no stars, just pure blackness that pressed down from all sides. We tried to turn back, but the route was nearly impossible to retrace. Every direction looked the same. The trees were black silhouettes against the black sky, and the bogs shimmered like invisible traps. Our footsteps grew cautious, careful not to slip into the mud or step into the water. The cold seemed to deepen now, colder than it had been all day, as if the forest itself had grown colder with the night. I felt panic start to rise in my chest. My partner's hand found mine in the dark, tight and steady, but I knew we were both scared. We had no torch. The batteries in our headlamps died hours ago, and I'd foolishly left spare ones in the car. No signal on our phones, no way to call for help. It was perfect darkness, the kind you don't see often unless you're far from civilization, and it was terrifying. The silence around us was complete except for the soft squelch of mud underfoot and the distant, muffled sound of something moving. I couldn't tell if it was the wind or some animal. Every few seconds, my heart jumped. Every shadow seemed to shift and grow. The cold was biting deeper now, fingers and toes numbing despite the layers we wore. We stumbled on, desperate for any sign of the trail, any break in the trees, anything. After what felt like hours, we found a faint path, the main route we'd meant to take, and relief flooded through me. But the relief was short-lived. Out of the blackness came a low, guttural growl. I froze. My partner squeezed my hand tighter. Ahead, shapes began to move just beyond the edge of the trail. Bulls, large, angry bulls. They were known to roam the area in winter, some wild, some owned by local farmers but loose in the forest. These ones were big, with thick horns and angry eyes shining in the faint light. The bulls charged. We tried to back away, but the ground was slippery and uneven. One bull came so close I could feel its breath, hot and rank. The sound of hooves pounding the frozen earth made my blood run cold. I remembered once, long ago, when my first wife was chased by a rampaging ram in the Scottish Highlands. That had been frightening, but somehow even funny in retrospect. This was something else entirely, bigger, more dangerous. We ran, not just fast, but desperately, blindly, through the trees and over bogs. My boots sank deep into mud, almost pulling me down. The branches scraped my face and tore at my clothes. Behind us, the bulls bellowed and charged again, their heavy bodies crashing through underbrush. At one point, my partner slipped, almost falling into a deep bog. I grabbed her just in time and pulled her back up. My heart hammered so loud I thought it would burst. I could feel the sharp sting of cold mud on my hands where I grabbed at her jacket. Eventually, we burst out of the forest onto a narrow dirt road. The bulls stopped at the tree line, watching us with angry, steaming nostrils. We didn't wait to see if they would follow. We ran down the road until we reached the village, finally finding a street lamp and the faint glow of houses. We were soaked, covered in mud, shaking with cold and fear. I looked at my partner's face, pale but alive, and realized how close we had come to losing everything. That reckless decision to take the shortcut, my stubborn pride, had put us both in terrible danger. If it hadn't been for a stroke of luck and pure adrenaline, we might have ended up trapped in those bogs or gored by those bulls. That night, wrapped in a warm blanket by the fire back at the car, I knew something had changed. I had always thought I was careful, that I could handle the wild, but I was wrong. I had underestimated the land, the cold, the darkness, and the animals that lived there. That choice to deviate from the path almost cost us our lives. I will never make that mistake again. No more shortcuts through unknown forests in winter. No more risking the perfect darkness that hides danger in every shadow. From now on, I will follow the trail no matter how boring or slow it seems, because some things aren't worth the risk. I still think back to that night sometimes, how the silence pressed on us like a living thing, how the bulls charged through the dark like nightmares come to life, and how close we came to disaster. It was my mistake, plain and simple, and I carry that with me every time I go into the wild. But it also taught me respect. Respect for the land, for the cold, for the dark, and for the simple wisdom of sticking to the known path. That respect saved us, in the end, even if I nearly lost us both first. Climbing that volcano in the dead of winter was one of the hardest things I've ever done. The cold was biting, the wind was relentless, and the ice under my crampons was slick enough to keep me on my toes every second. I had been pushing hard for hours, steadily axing my way up the slope, trying to keep my footing on the steep ice fields and frozen scree. The thin, icy air made each breath feel like fire in my lungs, but the thought of reaching the summit kept me going. By the time I neared the top, my fingers were numb, even inside my thick gloves, and my legs were shaking from the strain. The snow had been whipping around in swirling gusts all day, blowing ice crystals into my face so I barely saw a thing at times. But now, finally, I could see the summit ridge just ahead, a narrow knife edge of ice and rock slicing into the sky. The ice on the ridge looked solid, but something caught my eye just in front of me. A patch of ice that didn't quite match the rest. It was smoother, less frosted, and just slightly different in color and texture. It was subtle, but enough to make me stop and take notice. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I knew better than to ignore something like that. I wasn't stupid. I'd been on enough climbs to know that what looks solid isn't always solid, especially on a volcano that was essentially a frozen, brittle giant. I lowered myself carefully, planting my axe tip on the suspicious patch, and gave it a gentle prod. The axe bit in deeper than I expected, and the surface cracked beneath it. Before I could react, the ice under my feet started to shift. Then suddenly, it broke away completely. The ground gave way in a terrifying instant. I watched in horror as a jagged hole, at least 10 feet wide, opened right beneath me. For a split second, I could see straight down into a dark abyss. The crater of the volcano yawned below, hundreds of meters deep. The edge of the ice collapsed into the void, smashing through what must have been a brittle floor of frozen snow and rock. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. At that moment, I realized my weight had shifted forward with the ice breaking, and I was barely holding on to the edge with nothing but the tips of my crampons. The ground around me was rearranging itself, tilting, making my footing even more precarious. I had to scramble backwards fast, flailing my arms like a wild person, desperate not to fall into that black hole. I made this strange, awkward backward wheelie move, using my ice axes like anchors, digging them into the solid ice just behind me, fighting gravity with every ounce of strength I had. It was one of the most terrifying moments of my life, just hanging there between falling into the crater and slipping backwards down the mountain. I kept telling myself to calm down, to breathe slowly, but it was nearly impossible. The wind howled like a beast around me, freezing my face and sending tiny shards of ice into my eyes. My heart was racing, my hands shaking on the axes, but I managed to dig them deeper and get my legs under me. Slowly, inch by inch, I lowered myself to one knee, still gripping the axes hard. I looked around and saw that I was standing on the edge of a massive cornice, a large, unstable overhang of snow and ice that had formed over the side of the volcano. I hadn't realized until that moment how far out I had been walking. The cornice was cracked and broken in places, like a giant frozen wave about to collapse. If I had taken just one more step forward, I would have gone straight through and fallen to who knows where. I took a deep breath, my breath visible in the freezing air, and forced myself to stay calm. The sun was dipping behind the mountain now, casting long shadows across the icy slope. The wind was picking up, threatening to blow me off balance again. I knew I couldn't stay there forever. I gathered all my strength and slowly shifted my weight back onto solid ground, retreating carefully from the edge of the cornice. Every step felt like a gamble. The ice cracked softly under my crampons, a constant reminder that this mountain was a dangerous beast, ready to swallow me whole if I wasn't careful. As I moved back, I scanned the ridge behind me, looking for a safer route down. I didn't want to rush, but I also knew staying in one place was no good. The cold was starting to get into my bones, and my fingers were stiffening despite my gloves. I worked my axes into the ice for stability and edged sideways along the ridge, careful to avoid any other suspicious patches. The descent was slow and exhausting. I had to trust my instincts, and every step was deliberate. The wind was relentless, whipping snow into my face, freezing the moisture on my eyelashes. My legs were trembling, and my breathing was shallow, but I didn't dare stop for long. I was on alert for any sign of unstable ice or rock. Eventually, I reached a flatter section where the snow was packed hard and steady. The sense of relief was overwhelming. I stopped for a moment, crouching down to take off my gloves and rub my numb fingers. My heart was still hammering, but I felt a little safer now. The sun was setting fast, and I knew I needed to get back to camp before dark. The way back was no picnic either. The trail was mostly covered in snow, and I had to navigate around ice patches that could easily send me sliding down the mountain if I wasn't careful. I kept my ice axes ready and my crampons digging in as best as I could. The wind howled all around me, cold and unforgiving. By the time I got back to the base camp, the sky was a deep purple, the stars beginning to twinkle overhead. My fingers were frozen and my clothes stiff with ice, but I was alive. I set up my small stove to warm up some water for tea, my hands shaking as I moved. The experience had rattled me, but I felt a strange surge of gratitude. Grateful that I had trusted my instincts, grateful that I had noticed that patch of ice before it was too late. That night, lying in my tent with a thick layer of frost coating the outside, I thought about how close I had come to falling into that crater. The thought made my stomach churn. The mountain was beautiful, yes, but it was also cold, silent, and indifferent to anyone who tried to conquer it. I slept fitfully, dreams haunted by the image of the gaping hole beneath me, the cracking ice, and the desperate backward scramble to safety. When morning came, the sun rose over the ridge, painting the frozen slopes with soft gold light. I packed up quickly, eager to get off that mountain while I still could. The climb had tested me like nothing else before. It had reminded me how small and vulnerable I was in the face of nature's power. But it also taught me to be cautious, to respect the mountain, and to always pay attention to the signs beneath my feet. I left that volcano behind. The memory of the near fall burned into my mind forever. From then on, every step I took on ice or snow was careful and deliberate, never rushing, always alert. That winter climb was a stark lesson in humility, a reminder that the mountain doesn't care who you are or what you want. It only cares if you survive. And that day, I was lucky enough to make it back alive. I've had my fair share of close calls in the Idaho wilderness. Moose charging out of nowhere, storms that turn the sky into a black curtain of rain and wind, mountain lions lurking in the shadows, and even some encounters with people that left me uneasy. But the single most intense rush I've had in recent years came from something way less dramatic than I expected. It was one of those moments where your mind twists the smallest detail into a full-blown nightmare. It wasn't a storm or a mountain lion attack, but it still squeezed my chest like nothing else. It's a story I don't really like telling, but here it is. I was camped near an alpine lake high up in Idaho's mountains, roughly at 9,000 feet elevation. It was late summer, but the nights were already cold. The kind of cold that creeps under your skin and makes your breath cloud in the dim light of your headlamp. I'd had a rough day on the trail, longer than planned, tougher terrain, and a few missteps that left me tired and stiff. I was filtering water from the lake well after dark. The air was crisp and still, and the sky was completely overcast with high clouds. There wasn't a moon to light up the night, and with no towns or camps nearby, the sky was pitch black except for the thin beam of my headlamp cutting through the darkness. There's a reason parts of Idaho are designated dark sky reserves. The absence of artificial light out here is almost overwhelming. You can see the stars, no, not see. The stars seem to press on you like tiny sparks in a deep black void. It's humbling, but at that moment, all I could feel was exhaustion, the heavy weight of my muscles, and the cold that made me want to just crawl back into my tent. I crouched by the water's edge, filtering water with my Sawyer squeeze filter, the faint sound of dripping water the only noise. The lake was calm, its surface like glass reflecting faint outlines of the cliffs towering above. These cliffs rose steeply, almost vertical, sheer rock faces peppered with patches of talus and sparse shrubs clinging to cracks and ledges. As I worked, my headlamp swept across the rocky wall beside me. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a faint glimmer, something small and round reflecting the light. At first, I thought it might be a glint of a loose rock or maybe a trick of the light. But then it flickered again, a reflection, and I, up high, way above me on the cliffs, probably several hundred feet. I froze. The eye held still for a moment before moving slowly, then steadily descending. My heart started to pound, adrenaline creeping in to replace some of the tiredness. I wasn't hallucinating or imagining things. Something was coming down the cliff, and it was heading straight for me. The slope was brutal, too steep and rocky for anything other than a sure-footed climber. The usual suspects in these parts would be mountain goats or bighorn sheep, mountain lions, or bears. But bears don't usually climb sheer cliffs, and the color of the reflection ruled out black or white fur. It was a neutral tan or brownish color, which ruled out goats and sheep for the most part, especially since I never saw sheep in the area, and they tend to travel in groups anyway. It had to be a mountain lion. I've had several encounters with mountain lions before. They're magnificent but deadly animals. You respect their space, stay calm, and don't run. So far, that strategy has kept me safe. But this wasn't a usual encounter. The way this animal moved, focused, purposeful stalking, it reminded me of a story a friend told me about a lion attack that had nearly hospitalized him. It was the same cold, steady, unblinking approach. I didn't have any weapon on me. No trekking poles, no knife, just my headlamp, a small water filter, and my wits. My InReach satellite communicator was back at camp, so no way to call for help. If this thing wanted me, I was alone, and I knew if a lion attacked, I wouldn't stand a chance. My breathing got heavier. Every sound was amplified. The soft scrape of rocks, the faint rustle of dry brush on the cliff, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I slowly picked up a rock from the ground. Not much of a weapon, but it was better than nothing. My whole body was tense, ready to fight or run, but neither felt like an option. Then the animal stepped out from behind a huge boulder just a few feet away. I shone my headlamp directly on it. I expected a mountain lion's sleek, powerful body, its intense eyes fixed on me, muscles coiled for the attack. What I saw instead made me freeze. It was a mule deer doe, stupid, scared doe. She was standing there, as startled by me as I was by her. She had been the source of the reflective eye in the distance, her wide eyes shining in my headlamp's beam. She stepped down carefully to the water's edge and began to drink. Took a moment for my racing heart to slow down. I lowered the rock and shifted back from the water, giving her some space. The night was quiet again, except for the soft splash of her tongue lapping the cold lake water. After a few long seconds, she bolted away into the dark, disappearing into the night. I sat back down by the lake, headlamp off, taking deep breaths. My muscles started to relax, the adrenaline slowly ebbing away. The fear I'd felt was very real, but it was a trick of exhaustion and darkness playing on my mind. I finished filtering my water, packed up slowly, and walked back to my tent, careful not to make a sound. When I got inside my tent, I laid on my sleeping pad, staring at the tent ceiling, thinking about what just happened. The wild is full of surprises. Sometimes your mind can turn a quiet night into a scene from a horror movie. Sometimes you think you're face to face with a deadly predator when it's just a scared deer trying to survive the night as much as you are. It was a wake-up call. Not just to stay alert, but to respect the wilderness and the creatures in it, no matter how small or harmless they seem. By dawn, the sky was clear again, and the mountains glowed with the soft light of early morning. I packed my gear and started down the trail with a new sense of calm. The night's tension stayed with me for a while, but it was a reminder that in the wild, sometimes the scariest moments are the ones your mind creates. I never forgot that night at the Alpine Lake. The way the dark made everything more intense, the way my tired mind almost turned a harmless doe into a deadly predator. It taught me something important about fear and reality, and how sometimes the biggest scares come from inside your own head. The rain had been coming down steadily for most of the day. Not hard enough to be dangerous, but enough to keep everything damp and heavy and cold. I was somewhere near the Idaho-Montana border, not too far off from where the Continental Divide Trail weaves through the mountains and into forested valleys that seem to stretch on forever. I was about a month into my through hike, and though I'd already seen some rough weather in Colorado, nothing had made me as uneasy as that day. It wasn't just the rain or even the wind, though both were miserable in their own ways. It was how the forest felt. Hollow, like the trees themselves were tired. I remember the sound the most. The wind wasn't a steady howl. It came in bursts, and each time it picked up, the tall pines creaked and groaned like old ships straining against ropes. I could feel the tension in my shoulders, like I was bracing for something. Each gust made me clench my jaw, my hands gripping my trekking poles a little tighter. My shoes were soaked. My pants were stuck to my legs. I could feel cold water sliding down my back underneath my rain jacket. My hat had long since lost the battle with the wind, and the hood of my jacket kept flapping, occasionally letting water trickle down the back of my neck. There wasn't much to do except keep moving. I wasn't near any real shelter, and I didn't want to set up camp early. The slope I was traversing cut along a narrow ridgeline, with steep drop-offs to the left and an incline to the right thick with standing dead trees. Trees I didn't think much about at first. I'd passed plenty of them in the past few weeks, but this part of the trail seemed to run through an old burn zone, or maybe a beetle kill area, because so many of the trunks were gray and lifeless. No leaves, no needles, just skeletal wood standing still like grave markers lining the trail. I should have taken it more seriously. I'd read about blowdowns and the danger of deadfall in high wind conditions, but I'd never actually seen a tree fall before. It's the sort of thing that feels rare, like lightning strikes or avalanches. You know it happens, but it never happens when you're watching. Not until that moment. The wind had picked up again, hard. I remember squinting into it, lowering my head, trying to make out the trail ahead through the blur of rain. The air was filled with noise, rushing, howling wind mixed with the clicking of my rain jacket and the squeaking of wet nylon straps on my pack. But underneath all that, I heard something different. A crack. It was loud, sharp, like a gunshot. I stopped walking without thinking, just froze. Then I heard it again, louder this time and followed by a deep groaning sound. Not like the creaking I'd heard earlier. This was something straining, something tearing. My eyes went up the trail, and that's when I saw it. A pine tree, maybe 40 feet ahead, was moving, not swaying like the others, tilting. The whole crown of it shifted in a way that didn't make sense at first. I blinked. For a second, I couldn't process it. It looked like the top of the tree was sliding off center. Felt wrong, like watching a building bend. Then it tilted harder and I understood. The entire trunk was coming down, and it was coming straight at me. I should have moved immediately, but I stood there for half a second too long, just watching. I remember thinking how slow it seemed, like it was happening in slow motion. But it wasn't. My brain was just behind. The roots tore free with a loud pop, and the entire base of the tree twisted in the mud. Rain sprayed outward like a sheet of mist as the roots ripped from the soil. The trunk began to fall, and I realized it was going to land lengthwise, directly along the trail. If I stayed there, I'd be crushed. That's when something snapped in me. I remembered this scene from a movie, Prometheus, where the characters ran from a giant rolling thing by staying in its path instead of moving sideways. That moment of memory cut through the panic like a knife. I turned and sprinted to the right, off the trail, slipping in the wet leaves and needles, feet sliding on the slope. I ducked under a branch and threw myself toward the thicker part of the hill. I hit the ground just as the tree came down with a crash. The sound was unreal. It shook the air. I felt it more than I heard it. A deep, chest-rattling boom followed by a splintering crack. I turned and saw it, 60 feet of thick, gray wood stretched across the trail, a shattered end where the trunk had snapped as it hit the slope. The crown was a twisted mess of limbs and broken branches, some of them still swaying from the impact. I lay there in the wet dirt, heart pounding, breathing hard. My hands were shaking. I remember thinking I almost died. If I had hesitated another second, if I had gone forward instead of sideways, I would have been under that tree, crushed flat. No one would have found me for days, maybe weeks. After a minute, I stood up, wiped the mud off my hands, and slowly walked back toward the trail. I stared at the tree, tried to trace where it had fallen from. The wind was still blowing, and now every creak and groan made me flinch. The whole forest felt like it was holding its breath. I climbed over the fallen trunk, careful not to slip, and continued on, glancing up at every tree I passed for the next hour. That wasn't the only close call I had on that trip. A week or so later, I came within a step of putting my foot down on a rattlesnake. I was walking through a grassy stretch below Treeline, just south of Lemhi Pass, and the ground was warm, dry, and quiet. I'd been zoning out, thinking about my food resupply, when I heard that unmistakable rattle, dry, buzzing, and sharp. I froze again and looked down. The snake was stretched out across the trail, coiled loosely in the warmth of the dirt. I hadn't seen it at all. One more step and I would have landed right on its back. It didn't strike, but it didn't move either. It just stared at me with those cold, blank eyes and kept rattling. I backed away slowly, heart thumping in my ears, and detoured off the trail by a good 15 feet, keeping my eyes on the snake the whole time until it finally slid away into the brush. But the worst scare came later, somewhere in the Bitterroots. I was camped for the night near a small creek, maybe 15 miles north of Chief Joseph Pass. It was a quiet spot, too quiet actually. The air was still and the trees didn't move much. I'd set up my tent just before dusk, cooked my dinner about 100 feet away, and hung my food bag from a decent branch, though it was hard finding a good tree in that area. I went to bed early, exhausted. Sometime after midnight, I heard a sound, a slow, deliberate crunch of twigs just outside my tent. Then another. I held my breath. My body went rigid. I didn't move. I just lay there listening. There was no wind, no rain, just those footsteps, heavy, slow, padded. I could hear breathing low and steady, a sniffing sound, something brushing against the nylon wall of the tent. I didn't need to guess. I knew it was a bear. It circled the tent once, then again. I didn't have any food in there, just my sleeping bag, pad, and some clothes. But that didn't seem to matter. The bear wasn't in a hurry, kept sniffing, brushing the tent fabric with its side. I could see the silhouette of its bulk moving against the dim moonlight. It stopped by the vestibule, pressed its nose against the mesh, then moved on. I didn't move a muscle, not for 20 minutes. maybe longer. Eventually the sound faded, and the bear wandered off. But I didn't sleep much after that. I just lay there waiting for it to come back. It never did, but I kept a tight grip on my bear spray until sunrise. That section of the CDT northern Idaho into Montana was some of the most beautiful terrain I'd ever hiked. But it was also some of the most intense. The weather could change in a flash. The isolation was real. Cell service was non-existent. And the trail itself, while marked, often felt more like a suggestion than a path. I'd go hours without seeing another person. Days sometimes. The forest was deep and old and full of things that didn't care about you one way or another. That day with the tree stuck with me, more than the bear or the snake, because there was nothing aggressive about it, nothing intentional. It was just nature doing what it does. The wind pushed too hard. The tree was already dead. The ground was soaked, and gravity did the rest. It didn't target me. It didn't care that I was there. I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and somehow I lived through it. Pure chance. When I finally made it to the end of my through hike, months later, I thought about that tree more than anything else. People always asked what the scariest moment was, and I always pictured that crown starting to tilt. That snap of wood under pressure. The second where my brain finally understood. That's coming right at me. But I also thought about how I'd reacted. How something in me had kicked in, just fast enough. I'd spent so long preparing for the hike, gear lists, resupply boxes, trail reports. But no one tells you how to respond when death shows up without warning. No one tells you that your brain might freeze for a second, that you might not run right away, that even when it counts the most, you still have to remember to step sideways. I finished the CDT a little thinner, a little scruffier, and a lot more. It was a Friday in late October when me and three of my closest friends, Evan, Mark, and Jared, decided to go hiking deep into the woods for the weekend. We'd done day hikes plenty of times before, but this was the first time we planned to hike in and actually camp overnight far from any trailheads or park roads. The idea was simple. Disconnect from everything, get away from work and noise, sit around a fire, eat whatever we could cook ourselves, and sleep out in nature. We had a few supplies, tents, enough food, and water filters in case we needed to refill from a stream. None of us were exactly survival experts, but we weren't clueless either. We all grew up around the Appalachian foothills, spending time outside, hunting, fishing, just being in the woods, so this didn't feel like a big risk. The place we chose was about a 2-hour hike in from where we parked. It wasn't an official trail, more like a forgotten hunter's path we had read about online. We figured the remoteness would mean we'd have the entire area to ourselves. As we moved deeper into the woods, the trees started closing in tighter. The trail became harder to follow, covered with dead leaves, branches, and patches of brush that had been left untouched for years. Every now and then, we had to stop to check the map or let someone catch up, especially when we reached a steep ridge or a dry creek bed. It took us longer than expected to reach the clearing we had picked out on the map. It was just past a small slope on the northern side of a hill, tucked away behind a stretch of dense pines. The clearing itself was maybe 40 feet wide, relatively flat, and surrounded on all sides by trees that looked like they hadn't seen a chainsaw in decades. A soft layer of pine needles made the ground feel like a mattress. There were no signs that anyone else had camped there before. No fire ring, no trash, not even an old boot or bottle cap. It felt untouched, like we were the first ones in a long time to even walk through. We set up camp fast. 2 tents, one for me and Evan, one for Mark and Jared, positioned close together with enough room to move between them. About 6 feet away from the tents, we built our fire ring using rocks we pulled from the edge of the clearing. We cleared leaves, dug a shallow pit, and set up firewood that we gathered from nearby. The sky was starting to go dark when the fire finally caught. It was chilly, but not freezing, just cool enough that the fire felt good when you stood near it. As the flames grew and we all settled down around it, we ate, talked, and just let the sounds of the forest wrap around us. You could hear everything out there. Wind moving through branches, distant calls from owls, dry leaves skittering across the ground. maybe from squirrels or raccoons moving nearby. It wasn't completely silent, but it was quiet enough that anything out of place would stand out. That was part of what made the place feel so peaceful. At one point, just messing around, I took a long, thick stick I had found and started whittling the end of it with my knife. The others were laughing, saying I looked like a caveman, but I kept going. I shaved down one end to a pretty sharp point. It wasn't a perfect spear, but it looked kind of badass when it was done. I joked that it was for protection, in case something came too close during the night. Everyone laughed it off. Still, I jammed the point into the ground right beside my tent, sticking straight up just in case. Even though I wasn't serious, there was still a part of me that liked having it nearby. I've always believed that even a little preparation can make you feel a lot safer. After a few hours, the fire started to burn down. The logs were mostly embers, and we were tired from the hike, so we all climbed into our tents. I zipped up and got into my sleeping bag. It took a while for the forest noise to fade from my awareness, but eventually I drifted off. Couldn't have been more than an hour or so before I woke up again. The first thing I noticed was how still everything was. No wind, no rustling, just dead silence. I opened my eyes and lay there, staring at the dark fabric above me. The fire was dead by now, and the only light came from the moon filtering through the mesh at the top of the tent. I didn't know what had woken me until I heard it. Something outside, a low crack like a branch being stepped on. Then a second one, slower, heavier, like someone shifting their weight on dry wood. At first I thought maybe it was one of the guys going out to take a piss, but then I realized I hadn't heard any zippers. And whatever was out there wasn't moving like a person. It was too slow, too cautious, like it was testing the ground, trying not to be noticed. I could feel my heartbeat pick up as I listened. Another crunch, then a shuffle. It was close now, right outside the tent. I held my breath, lying perfectly still. Then something touched my foot. It was quick, but it was real. Just a light pressure through the fabric of the tent, like a hand brushing over it. Not hard enough to hurt, just enough to feel. I jerked back instinctively, pulling my feet closer to my body. For a second, I thought I might have imagined it. Maybe I had kicked the wall of the tent in my sleep. But before I could convince myself of that, I heard more movement, this time just outside the tents, like someone circling them. I whispered to the others to wake up, trying not to make any noise that would draw attention. After a few minutes, I heard the soft rustle of their tent opening. We all stepped out into the cold night together. The moon was high, casting long shadows across the clearing. Everything looked calm, but we were all alert, scanning the treeline, trying to find what had made the noise. That's when I looked over at the spot where I had left the stick, the one I had sharpened earlier. It was broken in half. The sharp end was still stuck in the ground, but the rest of it had been snapped clean. Not stepped on, not cracked from dryness, snapped. And the way it had broken didn't look accidental. The other half was lying about 4 feet away, like it had been tossed there. We didn't find anything else. No footprints, no signs of animals, no fur, no obvious trail leading away. The dirt was too packed to show impressions clearly. After searching the area with our flashlights for maybe half an hour, we decided to go back into the tents and wait for morning. We kept our boots on and knives nearby. I barely slept the rest of the night. Every sound outside felt louder than it should have been. Every gust of wind made me hold my breath. I didn't hear that slow movement again, and nothing touched the tent after that, but I kept expecting it. When daylight finally came, we got up fast and packed everything. The fire pit was just as we'd left it, our gear untouched, but that broken stick stayed in my mind the whole time. I picked up both halves and brought them with me. Part of me didn't want to leave them behind. Another part wanted to take a closer look at them later, like maybe I'd see something I missed. Claw marks, teeth, anything to explain what had happened. The hike back to the car felt different. The woods didn't feel the same in the morning light. It was like the trees were watching. Every snapping branch in the distance made me turn my head. We didn't talk much on the way back. I think all of us were trying to make sense of it in our own heads. And maybe we were each trying not to sound like we were scared. None of us said the word animal or tried to explain it with something logical. We just walked in silence until we reached the car. It's been almost a year since that trip. We never went back to that spot, and none of us have camped that deep in the woods again. I still have that broken stick, both pieces sitting in my garage. I've looked at them more than once, trying to make sense of it. There's no sign of teeth, no tool marks, nothing that suggests exactly what caused it. But it was broken on purpose. That much I believe. And I still remember the feeling of that pressure on my foot through the tent wall. That wasn't an animal stepping over me. It felt more deliberate than that. We survived that night. Nothing worse happened. But the part that stays with me isn't the fear, it's the not knowing. The fact that we were out there, miles from anyone, and something walked right into our camp, broke something we made, and then disappeared. It didn't try to hurt us. It didn't take our food or tear into our tents. It just came close enough to be noticed, close enough to remind us we weren't alone out there. That's what keeps me up sometimes. Not the danger, but the idea that someone or something was out there with us, watching, testing boundaries, letting us know we weren't as alone as we thought. And whatever it was, it knew exactly how close it could get. The sun was barely up when I laced my boots and stepped out of my small cabin on the edge of the forest. The air was crisp, a hint of chill still hanging from the night, and the sky was a soft gradient from pale orange near the horizon to deep blue above. I had planned this hiking trip for weeks. Just me, a pack full of essentials, and miles of untouched trails winding through the dense woods of the Appalachian foothills. It was supposed to be a weekend escape, a chance to clear my mind and soak up the calm of nature. The forest greeted me with a quiet stillness that was almost sacred. Pine needles cushioned my every step as I made my way along the narrow dirt path. The trees towered around me, ancient and steady, their bark rough under my fingertips when I paused to steady myself or check my footing. I noticed the subtle sounds. A bird calling somewhere above, the soft rustle of leaves as a breeze sifted through the branches, and the distant gurgle of a creek cutting through the valley below. Everything felt untouched, pure, as if the world outside didn't exist. The first few miles went smoothly. The trail was clear, marked by faded orange blazes on tree trunks every few hundred feet. I kept a steady pace, breathing in the scent of pine and earth, feeling my muscles warm and loosen up as I climbed steadily upward. At one point, the trail skirted a steep ridge with a narrow drop-off on my right. I paused to look down. The valley stretched out below, a quilt of greens fading into the morning mist. It was stunning, peaceful, and I could have stayed there for hours just watching the sunlight creep over the hills. But as the morning wore on, the trail grew less defined. The blazes became more sporadic, sometimes almost invisible behind moss and bark. The forest thickened too, branches brushing my shoulders and underbrush snagging at my pants. I wasn't worried yet. I knew the route well enough, and I had a map and compass tucked inside my jacket pocket just in case. I had done this hike before, though never alone for this long. I stopped to check the map and compass. The sun was high now, casting strong light through the canopy. I could see the general direction I needed to head, but the trees around me all looked the same, a wall of green stretching endlessly in every direction. I put the map away and pressed on, careful to note landmarks. An oddly shaped rock here, a fallen tree there, to help me keep track of my path. That's when the feeling settled in. Not fear exactly, but a creeping sense of unease that I couldn't shake. I glanced behind me, half expecting to see someone or something, but there was only the forest, calm and silent. My steps slowed, senses sharpening. The wind picked up slightly, carrying with it a faint, strange smell. Something sharp and metallic, like rust or old blood, faint but unmistakable. I scanned the trees, but saw nothing unusual. The trail soon became a faint dirt track, more a suggestion than a clear path. I had to push aside branches and step carefully over roots and rocks. My boots sank slightly into patches of damp earth, and the sound of running water grew louder ahead. The creek I had passed earlier must have curved back somehow, or maybe there was a small tributary. I welcomed the sound. Water meant I was near a natural landmark. Suddenly, I noticed the trail was gone altogether. The trees closed in, thick and tall, and the ground was uneven, littered with sticks and dead leaves. I stopped, heart beating faster now. The map was useless here, the compass only showing north, but no clear path. I felt a prickle of anxiety, the kind that comes when something small is off and you can't quite put your finger on it. I took a deep breath and decided to head toward the creek, hoping to find a trail or at least some sign of human passage. Moving carefully downhill, I could hear the water more clearly. Then I saw it. A thin, broken branch on the ground, snapped at an unnatural angle. Nearby, faint footprints in the mud. Too small to be from a deer, too human in shape and size. My pulse quickened. I had heard stories about hikers getting lost in these woods, sometimes running into trouble with hunters or worse. I wasn't sure who or what had left those prints, but I felt exposed and watched. I scanned the area again, my eyes searching for movement, but there was nothing but trees and shadows. I kept moving along the creek bank, hoping to find a clearing or a trail marker. The terrain grew rougher, steeper slopes, loose rocks, and wet moss making every step risky. My legs ached, and sweat trickled down my back despite the cool air. The sun had climbed higher and now beat through gaps in the canopy, creating spots of harsh light and deep shadows on the ground. Then, I heard it, a sudden crack of a branch breaking somewhere ahead, maybe 100 feet away. I froze, straining to listen. My breath came in short bursts, ears focused. The sound came again, faint but deliberate. Not an animal, I was sure. Something bigger, something moving with purpose. I debated whether to call out, but the silence around me swallowed my voice whole. No echoes, no replies. My stomach churned. The forest that had once felt like a peaceful sanctuary now felt like a trap. The shadows seemed to deepen, the air heavier. I started moving again, faster this time, sticking close to the creek. The trail had to be nearby. I remembered seeing a ranger station marked on the map a few miles downriver. If I could just reach the water, I might be able to follow it out to safety. But the forest resisted. Thick vines snagged my pack, thorny bushes scratched my arms, and the slope was slippery. As I rounded a bend, my foot caught on a root and I stumbled, falling hard onto the wet ground. My palms and knees scraped against sharp stones and dirt, pain flaring in my wrists. I sat up quickly, eyes darting around, feeling the sharp sting of the fall and a sudden surge of panic. The broken branch snaps were closer now, definitely following. I scrambled to my feet and started running, the creek roaring louder in my ears. I didn't look back, but I could feel a presence behind me, something moving fast, not animal, not human in any friendly way. I pressed on, heart pounding, lungs burning with effort. Then, the unexpected happened. The creek opened into a small clearing, bathed in sunlight. At the far edge stood an old wooden bridge, weathered and creaky, crossing to a dirt road I recognized from the map. Relief surged through me like a wave. I broke into a sprint, crossing the bridge carefully, the wood groaning beneath my weight. On the other side, the dirt road stretched out, disappearing into the trees. I could see tire tracks and a faint dust trail, evidence of recent use. Without hesitation, I started walking down the road, calling out in a low voice, hoping someone would hear me. Minutes later, I spotted a pickup truck parked near a small clearing. The door was open, keys hanging in the ignition. I climbed inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled onto the road, I looked back toward the woods. The shadows seemed to watch me, but I was safe now, out of their reach. The truck rattled over gravel as I drove toward the ranger station. My hands trembled on the wheel, adrenaline still coursing through my veins. When I finally reached the station, a ranger greeted me with a puzzled look, but I was too exhausted to explain everything right away. Over the next hours, I learned that the area I had wandered into was known for illegal hunting and poaching, and some groups didn't take kindly to strangers. The footprints and noises I had heard were likely from those people, moving through the forest with intent to keep their activities hidden. I had been lucky to stumble out where I did, where the road provided an escape route. Back at my cabin, the sun was setting, painting the sky in deep reds and purples. I unpacked my gear slowly, still shaken but grateful. The forest was beautiful and wild, but it held dangers beyond the animals and terrain. Dangers from other humans who viewed it as their secret domain. I promised myself I would respect those boundaries next time and never underestimate how quickly a peaceful hike could turn into a fight for survival. I slept deeply that night, the woods quiet outside my window, but my mind alert. The forest was a place of solitude and beauty, yes, but also a place where caution was more than wisdom. It was survival. And I had learned that lesson the hard way. The morning air was crisp as I tightened the straps on my backpack, the scent of pine thick around me. The trailhead was quiet, save for the faint rustle of leaves stirred by a soft breeze. The forest stretched out ahead, a vast tangle of green and brown shadows, promising solitude and a challenge. I had planned this hike for weeks, a solo trek deep into the woods, away from the noise of the city, away from people. I wanted nothing but the sounds of my own footsteps, the snap of twigs, and the occasional call of birds. It was supposed to be a simple weekend escape, nothing more. The first few miles were easy, the path well-worn and gentle. I moved steadily, the soft crunch of dirt and leaves beneath my boots keeping rhythm with my breath. Early sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting dappled patterns on the ground. I stopped occasionally to drink water or adjust my gear, admiring the way the forest held its quiet, endless watch. The trail wound alongside a narrow creek, the water bubbling clear and cold over rounded stones. The smell of wet earth was rich, grounding me even as my legs grew tired. As the day stretched on, the terrain grew steeper and rougher. The trees thickened, their branches twisting into darker shapes overhead. The trail narrowed, and roots snaked across the path like veins. My boots snagged on one, sending me off balance for a moment. The forest seemed to close in, sounds muffled beneath the weight of thick leaves and damp air. The silence pressed around me like a heavy blanket, making every small noise, a twig breaking, a bird flitting through the trees, feel suddenly loud and sharp. I kept moving, knowing the campground I planned to reach was still a few hours ahead. The sun sank lower, slipping toward the horizon, turning the sky a fading orange. I could feel the temperature drop already, the forest shifting from warm and welcoming to cool and watchful. My breath came out in little puffs, the chill creeping into my bones. My pack felt heavier now, weighed down by the food and water I carried, but I pushed forward, eager to find the clearing where I would set up camp. When I finally broke through the trees, the sight was both comforting and unsettling. The clearing was a small pocket of open sky and dry grass surrounded by dense woods on all sides. I could see my breath in the cold air as I set down my pack, the weight lifting off my shoulders with a sigh. I gathered firewood carefully, choosing dry sticks hidden beneath fallen leaves. The forest was full of moisture, but in the clearing the wood crackled as I struck a match. Flames licked upward, casting flickering light over the rough stones I arranged for a fire ring. I ate quietly, savoring the warmth and the soft glow. The sky darkened to a deep blue, stars beginning to prick the blackness overhead. No city lights, no hum of distant cars, just the night and the forest. I lay back against a log, watching the fire burn low, feeling a strange mix of peace and unease settle in my chest. There was something about being this alone, so far from anyone else, that pulled at a part of me I didn't often visit. That unease didn't go away when the fire was just embers and I crawled into my tent. The nylon walls fluttered softly in the night breeze, and the forest pressed close around me like a silent, waiting thing. I listened to the sounds outside, branches swaying, the occasional rustle of small animals, the distant hoot of an owl. But there was another noise, something softer and more deliberate. I couldn't place it at first. Maybe the wind playing tricks, or my mind catching shadows in the dark. Sleep came in fits, never deep or easy. Every creak or snap made me tense, heart thudding in my chest. I kept my flashlight close, the beam slicing through the black when I dared to look outside. The trees swayed but stayed where they were, nothing more than shapes and shadows. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't quite alone. Morning came slow and gray, the sky thick with low clouds that muted the light. I packed up quickly, eager to leave the clearing behind and get back on the trail. The forest seemed heavier now, damp with mist that clung to my clothes and skin. The path was slippery from overnight rain, roots slick and rocks slicker. Every step needed care, every move cautious. I wasn't in a rush. The memory of the night kept my senses sharp. Hours passed, the trail leading deeper into the woods and higher into rougher terrain. The trees thinned out, replaced by rocky outcrops and sparse brush. I stopped at a ridge to catch my breath, the valley stretching wide below, cloaked in fog that shifted slowly like smoke. The wind picked up, cold and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and something else. Something faint, metallic and sour. I frowned, scanning the ground. There were dark stains on the rocks, too dark and deep to be just wet earth. The feeling of unease crept back stronger than before. I told myself it was just old rust or iron deposits in the soil, but my steps slowed, eyes darting to shadows and shapes in the brush. I kept moving, but the forest seemed to shift. Every sound sharper, every movement unexpected. I caught glimpses of something in the corner of my vision, always gone when I turned to look. Footsteps, maybe, or something else. As the afternoon waned, the trail forked unexpectedly. I hadn't expected this, but the map showed a loop that reconnected a few miles ahead. I chose the left path, less worn and tangled with undergrowth. Felt wrong, but I pushed on. The trees grew closer again, branches scraping my jacket as I ducked under. The air thickened with humidity, and the forest floor was littered with broken branches and crushed leaves, as if something large had passed recently. My heart quickened when I spotted fresh footprints in the mud. Too large to be mine, and not like any animal I knew. They were deep, heavy, and scattered, like someone had hurried through here. There was no sign of a campsite or any other hikers. The trail grew narrower, harder to follow. I debated turning back, but the sky was fading, and I didn't want to get lost in the dark. My phone had no signal, so no way to call for help if I needed it. The only sound was my breathing and the occasional distant crack of a branch. Then I heard it, a low, rhythmic thudding coming from somewhere ahead. I froze, straining to listen. It wasn't animal or human in a way I could place. It was steady and deliberate. My mind raced through possibilities. Could it be a logging machine? No, the forest was protected here. A hunter? But hunting season was over. The sound grew closer as I moved forward cautiously, stepping carefully over roots and rocks. I wanted to see what it was, but also wanted to stay hidden. Then I stumbled into a small clearing, the ground muddy and churned up. There, half buried under leaves, were rusted tools, a broken axe, a rusted saw. The noise stopped suddenly. I stood frozen, the hair on my neck prickling. Then I saw it. Fresh tracks leading away from the clearing, deeper into the woods. They were big, the kind that didn't belong to any animal. My gut twisted with fear, but I forced myself to follow. I had no choice. The trail was gone, and I had to find the main path again. The forest grew darker, the thick canopy blotting out what little light remained. My steps echoed hollowly, the silence pressing hard. The air smelled of damp earth and old leaves, but beneath it was that sour metallic scent again. I kept moving, heart pounding with each step, until the ground beneath me suddenly gave way. I fell hard onto a pile of loose rocks and dirt, twisting my ankle painfully. The fall knocked the breath out of me, and I lay there for a moment, chest heaving. The pain was sharp but not unbearable. I pushed myself up slowly, testing my weight on the ankle. It held, though weakly. I needed to move, needed to get out of there. As I scrambled to my feet, I looked down and saw the edge of a shallow pit, no more than a few feet deep, dug into the earth and hidden beneath leaves and branches. That explained the fall. Someone had dug a trap, maybe to catch animals or worse. My skin crawled as I realized how close I had come to stepping into it fully. With great care, I edged away from the pit and followed the footprints, which now seemed to lead away in no clear direction. The forest closed in tighter still. I kept my eyes open for any sign of the main trail, my pack heavier and my ankle throbbing with every step. Suddenly, the ground beneath me softened again, and I almost slipped into another pit, this one cleverly camouflaged with moss and twigs. My breath caught in my throat. Whoever had made these traps was still close, watching. The thought chilled me more than the cold wind ever could. I forced myself to move on, limping along as best as I could. The sun had set completely now, leaving only a faint afterglow on the horizon. The forest was alive with sounds. Insects buzzing, leaves rustling, something moving just beyond sight. Every shadow looked like a threat. Then, through the gloom, I spotted a faint line of light filtering between the trees. Hope surged through me. The early morning air was crisp and fresh, a gentle chill that promised the start of a good day for hiking. I had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks. My plan was simple: drive out to the nearby national forest, hike a trail I had never been on before, and spend a night under the stars. The forest was well known, but I chose a less traveled path, a winding route that snaked through dense woods, rocky hills, and narrow streams. The trail was marked on the map as Blue Ridge Loop, about 12 miles long, promising both challenge and solitude. I started just after sunrise, the sun casting long shadows between the trees. The forest was quiet except for the occasional chirp of birds or the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. The smell of pine and damp earth was strong, and I breathed it in deeply as I stepped along the narrow dirt path. The ground was soft in places, scattered with fallen leaves and small twigs that cracked softly beneath my boots. The air was dry but cool, the kind of temperature that made me glad I had packed light layers. At first, the trail was easy, gently sloping and lined with tall pines and oaks. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, making patterns of light and shadow on the ground. I could hear the faint sound of a stream nearby, water trickling over rocks. Every now and then, I stopped to look around or take a sip of water. I was carrying a backpack with basic supplies, some food, water, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and an old map I'd printed from a website. I didn't expect trouble. I was confident in my skills and the route. The first few miles passed without incident. I saw a few other hikers, but mostly kept to myself. The trail grew steeper as it wound up the side of a ridge. The trees thinned, replaced by thick bushes and patches of bare rock. From a high point, I stopped to look back. The forest stretched out below me in a sea of green, the morning sun sparkling off the tops of distant trees. It felt good to be out here, away from the noise and busy streets. As I moved forward, the trail began to change. The dirt path gave way to rougher ground, roots and rocks making each step more careful. I kept my pace steady, careful not to slip. The sound of the stream was gone now, replaced by a quiet hum of wind through the branches. The air smelled different here, heavier with moss and wet stone. I noticed the sky had started to cloud over, soft gray clouds drifting low between the trees. By midday, I had covered about 7 miles. I found a small clearing beside a narrow creek, shaded by thick maple trees. I sat down on a fallen log and took a break, pulling out a sandwich and some nuts. The creek bubbled over smooth stones, clear water rushing in little splashes. Around me, the forest was still and peaceful, but I couldn't shake a feeling that something was off. It was subtle, a strange silence, maybe, or the way the trees seemed too close, closing in like walls. After eating, I packed up and checked my map. The trail ahead was supposed to loop around a small hill, then drop down to the valley floor where I could find a campsite. The weather looked like it might turn bad soon, but I figured I had plenty of time. I should be there by late afternoon. The next part of the trail was tougher. The path was narrower and less clear, the marks on the trees faded or missing in places. I had to watch closely to avoid losing my way. The ground was uneven and slick from recent rain, muddy in spots. At one point, I slipped on a moss-covered rock and caught myself just in time. My hands were dirty and scratched from brushing against thorny bushes. The forest here was dense. The trees were tall, their branches tangled together, making the light dim even in the afternoon. The air was damp and cool, with a faint smell of decay. The sound of birds had all but disappeared. Instead, I heard the occasional crack of a branch breaking underfoot or the distant caw of a crow. My breathing was steady, but my heart felt heavier with each step. About 3 miles from the clearing, I came to a fork in the trail. The map showed 2 possible routes. One was marked steep ascent, the other valley descent. The ascent looked shorter but harder. The valley route was longer but easier. I decided to take the valley, thinking it would be better for my energy and safer in case the weather worsened. The path wound down sharply through thick underbrush. I had to duck under branches and step over fallen logs. The ground was wet and slippery, and the sky had turned a deep gray, heavy with clouds. A low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. I picked up my pace, eager to reach the campsite before the rain started. Then it began. A slow drizzle at first, then steady rain falling through the canopy in drops and sheets. The leaves and branches dripped water, soaking my jacket and pants. The mud deepened, making my boots heavy and my footing uncertain. I kept moving, trying to keep calm, but the trail became harder to follow. The forest seemed darker, the rain dulling colors and sound. At one point, the path disappeared entirely beneath a small landslide. A mass of wet earth, broken branches, and stones blocked the way. I could see no way around without climbing dangerously steep slopes covered in loose rock. I was trapped between the mudslide and thick forest on either side. My map showed no alternate paths here. I sat on a large rock, wet and cold, trying to think. I still had some daylight, but not much. My phone was in my backpack, but the battery was low and there was no signal. The rain was coming down harder now, and the air was chilling me. I pulled on my rain jacket's hood and looked around. The forest felt closed in, the trees tall and dark against the gray sky. I decided to backtrack a little, hoping to find the fork again and maybe take the steep ascent route instead. It was harder, but safer than wandering off trail in the rain. I turned and carefully climbed back up the slippery path, my boots sinking into the mud. After what felt like an hour, I reached the fork. The trail to the steep ascent was nearly invisible, overgrown with bushes and fallen branches. The rain had soaked everything, and my hands were cold and numb as I pushed aside leaves and vines. I started up, gripping tree trunks and rocks to steady myself. The climb was brutal. The ground was slick and uneven, sharp stones cutting into my boots. My muscles burned with effort, and I felt the cold seep deep into my bones. Rain hammered down, soaking me through. The trees thinned as I gained height, replaced by bare rock and thorny bushes. The wind picked up, whipping rain into my face. Near the top, I slipped on a mossy patch and fell hard against a jagged stone. Pain shot through my leg and arm. I stayed still for a moment, breathing hard, trying to judge the damage. My arm was scraped and bleeding, and my leg ached sharply. I tested my weight on the leg. It hurt, but I could still stand. I wrapped a torn piece of my shirt around the bleeding cut and forced myself up. The summit was a rocky ridge with a small outcrop overlooking the forest below. I stopped there, shivering and soaked. The wind was cold and fierce, and the rain slowed to a mist. I looked out over the endless trees, gray and heavy under the storm clouds. I checked my map again. The trail was supposed to descend from here toward the campsite, but the path was faint and barely visible. I didn't want to risk losing the trail in this weather, so I decided to stay put until the storm passed. I found a small cave-like hollow in the rocks, just big enough to sit in and shelter from the wind. I settled down, pulling my jacket tight around me and trying to warm up. The pain in my leg was sharp, but I forced myself to keep moving it to avoid stiffness. My thoughts raced. I hadn't told anyone exactly where I was going, and my phone had no signal. I was alone, wet, hurt, and stuck in a storm on a rocky ridge far from the road. Night fell slowly as the storm eased. The rain stopped completely, but the sky stayed cloudy and dark. I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag, hoping to rest and gather strength for the hike out in the morning. Sleep came in short bursts. The cold and pain kept me awake most of the night. I listened to the sound of wind through the trees and the occasional drop of water falling from rocks. I felt completely alone in the vast forest, vulnerable and small. Morning brought a weak, gray light. The clouds were breaking up, and the air was still cool but calmer. I packed up slowly, stiff and sore, but determined to get down the mountain. The trail was muddy and rough, but easier now that it was dry. I took careful steps down the slope, using trees and rocks for support. My leg was painful but held. After a long, slow descent, I reached the creek where I had rested the day before. The water was clear and cold, and I drank deeply. I checked my map and saw the trail led from here back to the parking lot about 5 miles away. The walk back was tiring but steady. The forest seemed friendlier in the soft daylight, the trees alive with birdsong and movement. I kept a steady pace, stopping only to rest briefly or eat a snack. My body ached, but I felt stronger with every step. After several hours, It started as a simple plan. A solo hike through a well-known stretch of forest that ran along the ridge of a mountain in a region I had never explored before. I had read about it in some hiking forums, seen pictures online, and decided it would be a good challenge. Nothing fancy or extreme, just a day hike through rugged terrain, with the promise of some great views and the quiet company of nature. I was feeling good about it, prepared with my pack, water, snacks, map, and basic first aid kit. The weather was clear and warm, perfect for hiking. I left early in the morning, driving to the trailhead which sat near a small town that seemed sleepy even at 8 a.m. The parking lot was almost empty, except for a couple of other cars, which gave me a quiet feeling of solitude without complete isolation. I double-checked my gear, strapped on my backpack, and stepped onto the trail just as the sun peeked over the trees, casting long shadows on the dirt path. The trail itself was not difficult at first. It wound through dense pine woods, the needles soft underfoot, mixed with patches of dry leaves and small stones. Birds were active, calling out here and there, and the occasional squirrel darted across the path. The air smelled fresh, piney, with a hint of damp earth. I took my time, moving steadily but not rushing, enjoying the quiet and the sounds of the forest. As the morning passed, the trail began to climb more steeply. The ground became rocky in places, and roots stretched across the path like natural hurdles. I stopped to rest a few times, drinking water and eating some trail mix to keep my energy up. The sunlight filtered through the canopy in bright patches, warming the cool mountain air. I could hear the distant rush of a creek, which made me look forward to the next resting spot. After about 3 hours, I reached a small clearing where the trail crossed a narrow creek. The water was clear and cold, tumbling over smooth stones with a gentle roar. I knelt to splash some water on my face, feeling the coldness shock me awake. The sun was higher now, making the air warmer. I took out my map to check my progress, noting that I was just past the halfway point for my planned route. Up to this point, the hike had been peaceful and pleasant, just as I expected. I continued along the trail, which now followed the ridgeline. The trees thinned out a little, revealing glimpses of the valley below. The wind picked up, cool and steady, brushing against my skin and rustling the leaves. I stopped often to look out over the vast forest stretching away in every direction, a sea of green under the blue sky. It was a quiet, perfect moment, the kind of experience that makes all the effort worthwhile. But as I kept walking, something began to feel off. I can't say exactly when it started. Maybe it was the way the wind shifted, or the way the shadows grew longer and darker despite the sun still being high. The trail began to get rougher, less well-maintained. Branches and thorny bushes reached across the path, and patches of wet mud made footing slippery. I had to watch my step more carefully, moving slower. At one point, I thought I saw a figure out of the corner of my eye, something tall standing just behind a cluster of trees. I spun around quickly, heart beating faster, but there was nothing there, just the trees swaying gently in the breeze. I told myself it was just a trick of light and shadow, or maybe my imagination playing games. After all, it was getting late in the afternoon, and my body was tired. The forest here felt thicker, darker. The trail grew narrower and less distinct, almost disappearing under leaves and fallen branches. I checked my map again, but the terrain on the paper seemed vague, and I wasn't sure if I was still on the main path or had wandered off. The trees were all the same, tall pines and oaks, dense and uninviting. I stopped and took out my compass. It confirmed I was heading the right direction roughly, but the landscape offered no familiar landmarks to guide me. My phone had no signal, so I couldn't check GPS or call for help. I felt a tight knot in my stomach. I wasn't lost yet, but I could see how easy it might happen here. Deciding to press on, I moved more carefully. The sun began its slow descent, and the forest started to dim. The shadows stretched and deepened, and the cool air turned colder. My steps echoed oddly in the silence, and the feeling of isolation grew stronger. Then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic snapping sound, like someone stepping on dry twigs. It was faint but definitely there. I stopped moving and listened. The snapping came again, closer this time. I looked around, but the trees were still. No animals moved, no birds called. Only the sound of breaking twigs. I felt a surge of panic but kept calm. Maybe it was another hiker or a hunter out here. I called out softly, but my voice was swallowed by the dense woods. No answer. The snapping stopped abruptly. I took a deep breath and quickened my pace, hoping to put some distance between me and whatever was making the noise. But then I heard it again, footsteps now clearly following me, keeping pace with mine. I glanced behind but saw only shadows and trees. My heart pounded harder. I didn't want to run, afraid of tripping on the rough terrain, but I needed to get out of here. I kept moving faster, ears straining for any other sounds. The footsteps kept matching mine, never speeding up, never slowing. At one point, I veered off the trail to the side, hoping to lose whoever was behind me by hiding behind a thick tree trunk. I crouched low, breath shallow, and waited. The footsteps came into the clearing but stopped. I heard nothing else. No voices, no rustling in the bushes. Minutes passed like hours. Finally, I didn't hear the footsteps anymore. I stayed still for a while longer before cautiously standing and moving again. This time, I stayed as close to the trail as I could, watching my back constantly. The sun was nearly gone when I reached a fork in the path. The map was no help. Both routes looked the same on paper, and without landmarks I had no clue which way to go. I thought about staying put until daylight, but the thought of spending the night out here alone and unprepared was worse. I chose the right fork, hoping it would lead down the mountain faster. The trail descended steeply, and my legs burned from the effort. The darkness thickened around me, and I pulled out my flashlight, the beam cutting a narrow path through the trees. Every sound seemed amplified now, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a branch, the distant call of an owl. I kept reminding myself to stay calm, slow my breathing, and focus on each step. About an hour later, I finally heard something that lifted my spirits, the faint roar of a road. Encouraged, I pushed harder, navigating the rough slope with growing urgency. Soon, the trees thinned, and I emerged onto a dirt service road cutting through the forest. I followed the road downhill, my legs trembling but moving steadily. After another 20 minutes, I saw lights ahead, headlights actually. A small clearing opened up, and I realized I was near a ranger station or some kind of park building. I approached cautiously, relief washing over me. The doors were locked, but a vehicle was parked nearby, and lights shone from inside. I banged on the door and shouted until finally a park ranger appeared, surprised but helpful. I explained my situation, that I had gotten lost and felt like I was being followed. The ranger nodded seriously and radioed for backup. He said the area was known for hikers wandering off the trail and that people had reported strange sightings and sounds recently, probably just hunters or hikers making noise. I was driven back to the trailhead, where my car still sat waiting. The night sky was clear and full of stars, and I sat in the driver's seat for a long time before starting the engine, feeling safe but exhausted. That night, in my bed, I thought about the day, how easily I had lost my way, how real the fear was when I thought someone was following me, and how lucky I was to find help before things got worse. I knew I'd hike again, but I'd be more careful, more prepared. Nature was beautiful and peaceful, but it was also unpredictable and, sometimes, dangerous. The forest had tested me, and I had made it through, clear-headed and alive. I never saw who or what had been behind me in those woods, but maybe it didn't matter. Sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters, but just the feeling of being truly alone, vulnerable, and lost in a place where the world you know fades away. And that was enough. The sun had barely started to rise when I pulled on my boots and stepped outside my small cabin. The air was crisp, fresh, and smelled like pine and earth. It was the perfect morning to go hiking, and I had planned this trip for weeks. A solo hike deep into the forest on a trail I had never taken before. I needed the break from city life, the quiet, the stillness, and the chance to be alone with nature. I packed my backpack carefully the night before. Water, some energy bars, a map, a compass, a first aid kit, a flashlight, a lighter, and a small knife. I made sure my phone was fully charged, though I didn't expect much signal once I got far into the woods. The plan was simple. Follow the trail marked on the map for about 6 miles, reach a small clearing with a stream, rest there, then turn back before dark. Nothing complicated. I like to keep things straightforward when I hiked alone. The trailhead was just a short drive from the cabin. I parked my car, grabbed my pack, and started walking. The path was narrow and covered with a thick layer of fallen leaves from last autumn. The trees around me were tall and close, their trunks thick and rough, the branches mostly bare, though some still held onto stubborn patches of yellow and red leaves. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional bird call and the crunch of my boots on the leaves. At first, the hike felt easy. The path was mostly flat, winding gently along the side of a hill. I passed moss-covered rocks, small patches of wildflowers, and little streams crossing under wooden bridges. The sunlight filtered through the branches, casting a soft, warm glow. The air smelled like damp soil and pine needles, a smell I always found comforting. As I walked, I noticed small signs of wildlife. A squirrel darting up a tree, a rabbit disappearing into the underbrush, fresh deer tracks in the mud. I felt calm, peaceful, and a little bit alive in a way I hadn't felt in weeks. About 2 miles in, the trail started to get rougher. The ground rose sharply, and the path became rocky and uneven. I had to watch my step carefully to avoid twisting an ankle. The trees grew even thicker here, making the forest darker and cooler. The air felt heavier, too, like the forest was holding its breath. I stopped to take a drink from my water bottle and looked around. There was no one else here, no sign of other hikers or campers. Just me and the forest. I liked the solitude but also felt a flicker of caution. I reminded myself to stick to the trail and not wander off. After another hour, I reached a fork in the path. My map showed that the right fork led to the clearing I wanted, while the left went deeper into the forest and eventually looped back. I took the right path. This part of the trail was narrow and overgrown. Branches brushed my arms and face, and I had to step over fallen logs. The ground was uneven, and the forest grew darker with every step. I noticed how quiet it had become. No birds, no animals. The silence was almost too complete, as if something had left the forest empty. Suddenly, I heard a sound ahead, a rustling, like something moving through the bushes. I froze, heart pounding. I scanned the area but saw nothing. It was probably just a deer or some other animal. I told myself that as I kept walking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I moved faster now, eager to reach the clearing. The trail twisted sharply, and I had to hold onto tree roots to keep my balance. My legs were starting to ache, but I pushed on. After another 15 minutes, I finally broke through the trees and stepped into the clearing. The sight was beautiful. A small stream ran through the center, its water clear and cold. The grass around it was green and soft, with wildflowers growing near the edges. The sun shone down on the open space, making everything sparkle. I took a deep breath, feeling relief flood through me. I sat down by the stream and pulled out my water and food. As I ate, I listened to the gentle sound of the water flowing over rocks. The forest around the clearing was thick, and I could hear the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. After a while, I decided to explore the area around the clearing a little. I walked along the stream, careful not to slip on the wet stones. The water was so clear I could see small fish darting under the surface. The forest beyond the clearing looked dense and wild. I felt a strange sense of unease creeping back in. Something about this place didn't feel right. The forest seemed too quiet, too still. No birds sang here, no animals moved. The silence felt heavy, almost unnatural. I checked my watch. It was already mid-afternoon. I needed to start heading back soon to avoid being caught out after dark. As I turned to go, I noticed something unusual. Near the edge of the clearing, partially hidden under leaves and dirt, was a piece of old, torn fabric. It looked like part of a shirt or jacket, faded and stained. I crouched down to look closer. There was something else. A small, rusted metal object, half buried beside the fabric. I dug it out carefully. It was a pocket knife, old and worn, the blade chipped but still sharp. The handle had initials carved into it, but I couldn't make them out clearly. A chill ran down my spine. Why was this here? Who had left it? And why didn't I see any signs of a camp or fire nearby? I put the knife and fabric back where I found them, deciding not to take them with me. I didn't want to disturb anything, but the feeling of unease deepened. I started walking back along the trail, trying to ignore the quiet. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees casting long shadows in the late afternoon sun. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. About 20 minutes into the hike back, I heard something again. This time it was closer, a soft crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. I stopped and listened. The sound stopped too. I looked around, but the forest was still. No movement, no sign of anyone or anything. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I told myself to stay calm. Maybe it was just an animal or my imagination. I picked up my pace, eager to reach the fork and get back to the easier path. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure, tall and thin, standing just beyond a tree. It was too still to be an animal, and the shape looked human. I froze. The figure didn't move or make a sound, just stood there watching me. Panic surged through me. I didn't know who or what this was, but I knew I needed to get out. I turned and ran back the way I came, my boots pounding on the rocky trail, heart in my throat. Branches whipped against my face and arms. My breath came in sharp gasps. I didn't look back. The trail became steeper and I stumbled several times. I scrambled over rocks and roots, adrenaline carrying me faster than I expected. When I finally reached the fork, I took the left path without hesitation. It was longer, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get away from that clearing and the figure. The left trail led me down the hill, twisting through the thick forest. My legs were burning, but I kept moving. The forest here was darker and damper, with moss hanging from branches and the smell of decay in the air. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure following me. But there was nothing. After what felt like hours, the trail opened up into a wider dirt road, the one I had driven in on. Relief washed over me like a wave. I ran down the road until I saw my car parked at the edge of the trees. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it. For a moment, I just sat there, breathing hard, hands shaking. I looked at my phone. No signal. Of course. I started the engine and drove away, the forest disappearing in the rearview mirror. Once I was back in town, in a place with people and lights and noise, I thought about what had happened. The figure, the knife and torn fabric, the eerie silence. It didn't make sense. There was no trail sign of recent visitors near the clearing, no campsite or footprints. Whoever or whatever was there had been careful not to leave much behind. I told myself it was probably someone living rough, maybe a hunter or someone hiding out in the woods. The forest could be unforgiving, and not everyone who came here did so with good intentions. I decided to report what I found to the local ranger station the next day. The knife, the fabric, and the strange figure I had seen. Maybe someone was missing or lost. Maybe the forest held more secrets than I had realized. But for me, that hike was over. I learned that the woods are beautiful, but they can also be dangerous. And sometimes, when you go far enough, you might find things you don't want to see. From then on, I stuck to well-known trails and never went hiking alone in the deep forest again. The peace I once found there was replaced by caution and respect for the unknown. That day taught me that nature isn't just a place for adventure and beauty. It can also be a place where people's stories and secrets linger, hidden beneath the trees and shadows. And sometimes, it's better to leave those stories undisturbed. The trail started early in the morning, before the sun was fully up. I had planned this hike for weeks, a solo trip through the deep woods of the Appalachian Range. I was carrying my pack with everything I needed: water, food, a small tent, some warm clothes, a first aid kit, and a good map. I had checked the weather forecast the day before, and it promised a clear weekend with no rain, cool temperatures, and light winds. Perfect hiking conditions. The first few miles went well. The path was narrow and winding, covered with pine needles and patches of soft moss. The air was fresh, smelling of damp earth and pine resin. I could hear the distant call of birds waking up, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Occasionally, I passed by rocky outcrops where the trees opened up just enough to give a clear view of the valley below. I stopped a few times to catch my breath, drink water, and take pictures of the landscape. As the morning moved on, the trail became steeper. I was climbing a ridge, and the sun was now rising higher, casting long shadows through the trees. The forest was dense, mostly hardwoods and some evergreens. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, with roots and loose stones making each step a bit tricky. I paid close attention to my footing, making sure not to twist an ankle or slip. Around midday, I reached a small clearing. I sat down on a fallen log to eat some lunch: peanut butter sandwiches, a handful of trail mix, and an apple. The clearing was quiet except for the sounds of the forest. The sun shone through gaps in the canopy, warming the open space. I looked at my map and noticed that the trail ahead was supposed to circle around the ridge and then descend into a small valley. From there, it would follow a creek back towards the parking area where I left my car. I packed up and continued. The trail began to descend gradually, winding through thick underbrush and patches of ferns. The air was cooler here, shaded by the tall trees. Occasionally, the path crossed over small streams, where I paused to drink some water and splash my face to stay fresh. The sound of running water was calming, but also made me more alert, knowing that water attracts wildlife and sometimes people. About 3 hours into the hike, I came to a fork in the trail. According to the map, the right path was the main trail, well marked and used often, leading directly to the creek and then back to the parking lot. The left path was marked as a shortcut, a less maintained route that would save about 2 miles. I looked down the left path. It was narrower, overgrown with bushes, and the trees leaned in close overhead. It didn't look inviting, but I was feeling good and confident, so I decided to take it. At first, the shortcut was manageable. The path was rough but passable. I had to duck under low branches and step over fallen logs. The trail twisted and turned, sometimes losing the clear markings, but I followed the faint blazes on trees. About 30 minutes in, I realized that the shortcut was longer and tougher than I expected. The path climbed again sharply, and the ground was covered with loose rocks that made climbing difficult. My legs burned, and I slowed down to catch my breath. Suddenly, I noticed something odd. The trail seemed to disappear ahead. I stopped and looked around. The trees here were older, the forest thicker, with thick layers of fallen leaves and branches covering the ground. The faint blazes were gone. I looked back, and the trail behind me was faint but still visible. I took a few steps forward, trying to find any sign of the path. Nothing. The underbrush was thick, and it felt like I was standing in the middle of a dense forest with no clear way out. I pulled out my map and compass. According to the map, I should be heading slightly downhill and northeast, but the trees all looked the same. I turned on my phone's GPS. No signal. Of course, this part of the forest was too deep for reception. I put the phone away, feeling a little uneasy. I was alone, off the main trail and possibly lost. I sat down on a rock to think. I remembered my survival training and tried to stay calm. The sun was still high enough in the sky to give me some daylight. I decided to backtrack carefully to the last point where the trail was visible. I marked that spot mentally, knowing that if things got worse, I could try to stay there and wait for help. As I turned around, I noticed something else. A faint smell, not like the usual forest smells. It was more like smoke, a burnt smell, but very faint. I looked around but saw no signs of fire or smoke. Shrugging it off as probably a campfire from earlier in the week, I focused on finding the trail. The climb back was slow and careful. I used my hiking pole to test the ground ahead, pushing aside branches and making sure the rocks were steady. Eventually, I found the blaze marks again and followed them downhill. Relief washed over me as the path became clearer and the trees started to thin. About half an hour later, the trail opened up to a small creek crossing. The water was clear and cold, and I drank deeply. I felt a little more relaxed but still alert. The forest seemed to close back in around me, but the path was easy to follow. Then I heard a noise. Not animal noise, something heavier, slower, like footsteps, but not quite matching the sound of my own steps. My heart jumped. I stopped and listened hard. The noise stopped as soon as I stopped. I looked around carefully, trying to spot the source. The forest was thick, but the shadows didn't show any movement. I kept moving, faster now, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. The trail climbed slightly before descending again towards a wider clearing. I reached the clearing and stopped, breathing hard. The place looked familiar, but I couldn't place it on my map. That's when I saw it. An old abandoned cabin, partially hidden by vines and trees. It was made of rough wood, the roof sagging, windows broken. I hadn't seen it marked anywhere on the map. My mind raced. Could it be a hunter's cabin? A ranger's outpost? Or something else? Despite the unease, I walked closer, wanting to check it out in case I could find some clues about where I was. The door hung open, creaking slightly in the breeze. Inside, the floor was covered with leaves and debris. There was an old rusted stove, broken furniture, and scraps of paper scattered on a table. I searched the papers. Some looked like old notes, others maps. One of the maps showed the surrounding forest but included markings not on my map, including the cabin itself and paths leading deeper into the woods. I studied it carefully, noticing that some paths led to a road about 2 miles away. I felt a little hopeful. If I could find that road, I could get help or at least get back to a place with signal. I took a deep breath, stuffed the map into my jacket pocket, and stepped outside. The sun was starting to dip low in the sky. I had to move fast. I followed the path marked on the old map, pushing through thick brush and climbing small ridges. The forest was quieter now, the shadows longer and cooler. The air smelled damp and earthy. After an hour of hard walking, I finally saw a break in the trees. Through the branches, I could see a faint line of asphalt. An old, narrow road, cracked and overgrown, but unmistakably a road. I walked down to it and sat on the edge, exhausted but relieved. Pulling out my phone, I tried again. This time, a weak signal popped up. I quickly sent a message to a friend with my location, then waited, watching the road. About 20 minutes later, I heard a car approaching from the distance. A pickup truck rolled up slowly, dust rising from the gravel shoulder. The driver waved as they stopped. Relief flooded me. I climbed in, and they drove me back to the main highway and then to the nearest town. I was tired, hungry, but safe. Looking back at the forest as we drove away, I thought about how easy it had been to get lost, how important it was to stick to the main trail, and how lucky I was to find that cabin and the old map. The experience taught me a lot about respect for nature and preparation. Hiking alone was an adventure, but also a risk. Next time, I'd take more care, tell more people where I was going, and maybe bring a GPS device or extra maps. The forest was beautiful and wild, but it could also be unforgiving. I was glad to be back on solid ground, and I knew I'd never forget that hike. Not because it was scary or dangerous, but because it reminded me how important it is to be prepared, patient, and alert when venturing into the unknown. The sun was just beginning to rise when I started my hike, the air crisp and cool against my skin. I had planned this trip for weeks, a solo trek through the rugged wilderness of the Appalachian foothills. I wanted a break from the noise and stress of the city, to lose myself in the steady rhythm of walking and breathing in the quiet of the forest. The trailhead was easy to find, a small gravel parking lot surrounded by towering pines and hardwoods, the ground damp with early morning dew. My pack was heavy with essentials: water, snacks, a first aid kit, a map, and a flashlight, but I felt ready, eager to take on the challenge. The path ahead was narrow, winding through dense woods where the sun filtered down in long shafts of golden light. The air smelled rich and earthy, mixed with the scent of pine needles and wildflowers. Birds sang somewhere high in the canopy, their songs distant but clear. I stepped carefully over roots and stones, my boots crunching softly on the leaf litter. The forest was alive, but calm, as if it had been waiting just for me. I had chosen this trail because it promised both solitude and a good workout. Steep climbs, rocky scrambles, and some beautiful overlooks. I wanted to test myself, to push my limits a little. My plan was to hike deep into the woods, camp overnight near a small creek, then head back the next day. The weather forecast was clear, no rain expected, so I felt confident. As I walked, I kept an eye on the trail markers, bright orange rectangles painted on tree trunks, and checked my map often. The trail was well maintained but remote enough that I only passed a couple of other hikers in the early morning. Each time, I nodded politely but didn't stop to chat. I liked the silence too much. The climb began after the first 2 miles. The path narrowed, steepened, and the trees grew even taller and thicker. My legs burned as I pushed upward, using my trekking poles for balance. Sweat soaked my shirt, and my breath came in steady, controlled gasps. The higher I climbed, the cooler the air became, and the forest around me felt denser, darker. The sunlight barely touched the ground here, blocked by the thick canopy overhead. I reached the first overlook just before noon. The view opened wide to rolling hills covered in green and gold, stretching out under a blue sky dotted with fluffy clouds. I sat on a large rock and ate a small meal, a sandwich and some trail mix, savoring the quiet and the beauty. My water bottle was already half empty, so I made a mental note to refill soon. After a short break, I continued deeper into the forest. The trail twisted and turned, sometimes flat, sometimes rising again. The terrain grew more rugged, with loose rocks and fallen branches to navigate. I kept my eyes on the trail, alert for any signs of wildlife or hazards. Deer tracks crisscrossed the path, and I spotted a red fox slipping silently between the trees. The forest began to feel less familiar, even wild. The trees were older, the underbrush thicker. I noticed the occasional broken branch, the scrape of bark on a tree trunk. It was as if something had moved through here recently, something big. I tried not to let it worry me. I reminded myself that wildlife was normal, part of the wilderness experience. Still, a subtle unease crept in. My steps slowed, my senses sharpened. The wind shifted, carrying unfamiliar sounds, snapping twigs, rustling leaves. I stopped and listened, holding my breath. The forest seemed to hold its breath with me. The trail forked suddenly, and I stopped to check my map again. I was at a junction I hadn't expected. The markers here were faded, half hidden under moss and lichen. I knew which way to go but hesitated. The left path looked overgrown, less traveled. The right path seemed clearer but led away from my planned route. I chose the left, trusting my instincts. The underbrush closed in, thorny vines catching on my sleeves, branches scraping my face. The trail disappeared under fallen leaves and pine needles. My heart beat faster. I felt like I was walking into a part of the forest that didn't want to be disturbed. After about 20 minutes, I realized the trail had vanished completely. I was stepping blindly between trees, trying to follow faint signs. A broken twig here, a disturbed patch of earth there. My confidence faltered. I took out my compass and map again, trying to reorient myself. The sun was moving lower, and the shadows lengthened. I started to feel the weight of isolation settle heavily on me. No other hikers, no sounds except the occasional bird call and the crunch of my own footsteps. I realized I had no phone signal. My heart sank. I was truly alone, lost in the woods. I tried to calm down, told myself to think clearly. I had the gear I needed: water, food, a flashlight, a knife. I could stay safe. I decided to backtrack to the last recognizable point, then follow the main trail. But when I turned around, the forest looked different. Trees blocked my path, and the sun was dipping behind thick clouds. I pushed forward anyway, brushing aside branches, stepping over roots, trying to find the way. Time passed slowly. The sky darkened to a dull gray, and the wind picked up. It rattled through the branches, carrying the sharp scent of damp earth and pine sap. I felt the first drops of rain on my face and hurried to find shelter. There was no trail, no path, just dense forest. Then I heard it, a distant, irregular sound. Not natural. It was a low, rhythmic thumping, like heavy footsteps or something dragging. I froze. My breath caught. The sound came closer, mixed with cracking branches and leaves crunching underfoot. I scanned the trees but saw nothing. Panic surged. I knew the forest could be dangerous at night, with wild animals and rough terrain. But this sound was different. It was deliberate, something moving with purpose. I gripped my knife and flashlight, ready to defend myself if needed. I decided to climb a tree to get a better view. The bark was rough under my fingers, and the branches creaked as I pulled myself up. From here, I could see a small clearing. The thumping noise stopped suddenly. The forest fell silent again, except for the rain now falling steadily. I stayed in the tree for nearly an hour, shivering but alert. Finally, the rain eased, and the sky began to lighten. I climbed down carefully and decided to keep moving toward what I hoped was the trailhead. As I walked, I found signs of human presence. An old rusted can, a piece of torn cloth caught on a branch. The forest began to thin, and after a while, I spotted a narrow dirt road in the distance. Relief flooded me. I headed toward it, stumbling out of the trees and onto the road just as the sun rose fully. I followed the road down the hill until I reached a ranger station, where I found help and warmth. They called search and rescue, who later confirmed there had been reports of illegal activity in the woods I had wandered into. People setting traps, hiding from the law. The strange noises I heard were likely those individuals moving around. I was shaken but unharmed. The experience taught me to respect the wilderness even more and to always prepare for the unexpected. I never took another solo hike without telling someone exactly where I was going and carrying a GPS device. That trip stayed with me for years, a reminder that sometimes the scariest things aren't myths or monsters, but the real dangers hidden quietly in the wild places we think we know. And that survival depends on caution, calm, and respect for the unknown.